My pleasure to welcome you to the another installment of our seminar series. As a reminder, we are recording the event other than the Q&A. We won't record the Q&A, but this time. But for those of you watching at home, I'm sorry, but you'll have to just contact Dylan with your questions and see if they're the same. And yeah, otherwise, I will pass it on to Stefan. Stefan for introducing our speaker today. Thank you.
Thanks, Fernando, and it's indeed my big pleasure to introduce Dylan. Dr. Dylan Connor, many of you know him, still know him, and know him from current work, is giving us a talk. We are really looking forward, as you can see the title already here, The Changing Populations of Economic Fortunes of Small Places in the United States. Finally worked out to have Dylan give his presentation. Last time we had to cancel our talk, unfortunately. Dylan has a PhD in geography from the University of California, Los Angeles. He did a Master's of Science and Statistics from the University of Leuven and an MA in geography at the University College Dublin. Dylan is currently an assistant professor at the School of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning at Arizona State University. He is an affiliate with the Institute for Social Science Research, and he is a member of the Spatial Analysis Research Center at ASU. Dylan, as many of you know, has been a postdoctoral research associate here at IBS with us and has been working with us for quite some time. And his expertise he describes as in the fields of urban development, history, inequality, quantitative analysis, and immigration. Dylan teaches in statistics, research methods, and many other special topics. He has taught urban geography at CU Boulder, as you well remember, a very popular course in geography. And Dylan usually uses big data to study the role of geographic forces in shaping human behavior, migration, social mobility, and inequality over long time periods. He has a lot of ongoing work that I don't want to go into detail right now. He will give us a deep dive into a very interesting project that we are working on together. He's the institutional PI of a project relating to inequality and sea level rise exposure in cities, funded by the NSF, and the changing demography and health of small town America, funded by the NIH. Many of you know this latter project as the Tiny Towns Project. We have been engaged together on for quite some time at IBS. Dylan's recent publications have been placed in high impact outlets such as Demography, Communications, Earth and Environment, Earth System Science Data, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, just to mention a few. Very impressive, and we are lucky to have him finally give his talk. Looking forward very much. Dylan, this is your stage. Welcome.
Thanks, Stefan. I really appreciate it. Is the audio okay?
Yes, sounds good.
Perfect. Okay, so thanks for joining, everybody. I'm delighted to come and give you a talk, and particularly given that the content is coming out of that Tiny Towns project. So I'm really looking forward to it. I was telling Stefan and Fernando, this is a very unlucky seminar for me because the last time I scheduled, I got very sick on the morning of the on the morning of the talk and had to cancel. I think it's the only time I've had to cancel a talk. And then last week I blew my knee out playing soccer. So it's like anytime I'm on the agenda here, something's working against me. So what I'm going to talk about today is a project in collaboration with Stefan here, Laurie. I'm not sure who else is on the call, but I'll put up the names of the IBS folks in just a moment of who else is working on this paper. And it's focused on the changing demographic and economic structure of small places in the US over the last 40 or so years. So just to put the kind of general framework of the work that I'm going to talk through here and kind of my own research trajectory a little bit. So over the last couple of years across different types of projects, I've really been focused on changes in places and in local context and how those changes, particularly over long time periods, relate to shifts in a range of social and economic outcomes. So just two quick examples here. Last year, myself and Michael Storper published a paper in PNAS where we were basically looking at the geography of intergenerational mobility in the US over about a century, and looking at how changes in social mobility outcomes related to things like changes in local economic development or changing social structures. And in the second project, which is part of a separate research strand, I've been working with Stefan Johannes Ohl and his team, particularly on the CDISC project from NSF, using the Zillow data to actually study the evolving urban structure of the US over a very long time period. So a lot of the work I've been focused on has been on changing geographical patterns over the 20th and into the 21st century. And what I'm going to show you today is actually a third stream of this work, which is taken it from a different perspective. And I'm really looking forward to talking through this with you. So what we're working on here, it's coming out of an NIH project led by Laurie, and we call it the Tiny Towns Project. And what we're really focused on is trying to understand the changing economic and demographic structure of rural places in a kind of a longitudinal sense from 1980 and increasingly further back up until the present day. So there's a couple of reasons to really care about this project, I think, and why this project is timely. The first is that we know from urban economics and economic geography that since about 1980, the economy has really come to favor a set of kind of big superstar cities. So, San Francisco's, your New York's, increasingly places like Denver and Phoenix, have really risen to the kind of top of the kind of economic hierarchy in the US and increasingly pulled away in terms of spatial inequality. And there's this sense that at the same time, rural places have really been suffering through this transition. Income inequality has been skyrocketing. We all know about the political polarization that's also playing out geographically. And what's interesting intellectually in terms of these changes is that there's this enormous literature on cities and urban development, but there's actually been very little focus on how these types of patterns and how these changes have unfolded across rural places. So I think many of us kind of have a pretty kind of simple perspective on rural change in the US over recent decades. And part of what we're trying to do here is actually unpack that a little bit and examine it a bit more systematically. So what I'm going to talk through in this paper is an effort that we put in to examine kind of dominant trajectories of rural economic and demographic change from 1980 up until 2018. And then in the later stages of the project, I'm going to show how these trajectories actually do or do not relate to intergenerational economic mobility outcomes. So just before I jump into the actual substance here, so Fernando asked me whether I want to take the Q&A at the end or whether I'm happy to be interrupted. So I'm happy for you to stop me if you have any clarification questions or anything like that. Just definitely interject, and I'm happy to stop and talk. If not, then we can just keep it to the Q&A at the end. Okay, so just to kind of give a kind of a quick snapshot of some kind of popular media accounts of small town America, which I think are interesting and relevant here. So a couple of years ago, the Washington Post did a write-in soliciting letters from different parts of rural America where they wanted different perspectives on what was happening locally. I thought this was a particularly interesting letter. It came from Michigan. And the quote reads, please visit the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. There's drugs, some people drink far too much, but we also have very high unemployment and things were not always this way. And the letter kind of goes on to kind of basically make the case that the kind of social problems that are in these kind of smaller places in Michigan are not, the product of some deep local culture, but they're actually a product of local structural economic changes and the decline of industry and extraction in these places. So there's this sense that local change is kind of partly a function of these kind of bigger economic transformations that are going on. The Atlantic ran an article in 2016, really focused on the kind of graying of rural America. So rural places have been getting older over recent decades on average. And I think a lot of us are familiar with this perspective, but perhaps less familiar to us is actually this New Yorker story, which is titled Where the Small Town American Dream Lives On. And it was really kind of a profile of this place called Orange City in Iowa, which is actually quite a vibrant small place. It's got a local college, the population is growing, people seem to be doing reasonably well economically. And the article was kind of making this case that there are these communities that seem to actually be doing quite well amid this kind of bigger story of rural decline. So effectively, these different faces of rural America is really what we're trying to dig into here and try to understand a little bit better and see if we can put a kind of a systematic framing on what we're trying to do here. Okay, so why hasn't this been studied before? You know, or why, you know, has it not been studied in this way or in this kind of level of detail before? Well, one of the reasons is that there's serious methodological constraints in trying to study rural places over time. And I'm going to talk through kind of 3 methodological innovations that kind of touch on things that we developed as a team. There's different papers related to different parts of what I'm going to talk through right now. So happy to share any more details as needed. So let me just start with a couple of the key problems. So the first is, when it comes to urban and rural places, a lot of the standard definitions and classifications of whether an area of the country is rural or urban actually comes from a county definition. So the USDA maintain these rural-urban continuum codes, which are basically a set of codes or classifications that get applied to counties throughout the country. And they're supposed to roughly provide some kind of framing of how urban or rural the place is. So I've listed the RUC codes, as we call them, in this table here. And so what you can see is that codes 0 through 3, these are typically certainly thought of as urban counties. They kind of range from metro areas with a million people or more down to counties and metro areas of fewer than 250,000 people. So we'd normally think of these as being very urban counties, and usually rural studies tend to focus on these kind of from 4 down through 9 here in some mix, depending on how flexible or restrictive you want to be in terms of defining rural places. So there's a couple of problems here. The first is that, as we all know, even around Boulder or around Phoenix or wherever you are, you usually don't have to drive very far to start hitting rural places. And so the classification of rurality based on a kind of county level aggregation always runs into this issue where you're definitely absorbing some rural places into your urban counties. So, you can drive 10, 15 minutes from the campus and see Boulder, and you're immediately in, a place that feels quite rural or relatively rural. And you might start to think, well, that type of place should certainly be in our analysis. But if you're using these county codes, that might be unlikely, and that might be, particularly unlikely in some regions of the country relative to others. So the first is that by using a county classification, you obscure a lot of heterogeneity. And the second is that we really wanted to focus on small places in a kind of a social science context where we're thinking about these kind of local organizational units or places that we want to be able to follow over time. So we're really trying to capture something that looks a little bit like what we call the kind of neighborhoods of small town America. So all of this is to say that the kind of county classification here is just not the best way forward for what we're trying to do here. There's a lot of value in the county classifications, but we're looking for something slightly different. And so what we turn to are census places. So there's around 3,000 counties in the US, but there's over 20,000 census places across the country. And so we focus on this kind of sub-county unit as our main unit of analysis. And really the first step in our project was to try and build a longitudinal data set of rural places across the 1980 to 2018 period. So particularly Laurie and Catherine Talbot at IBS really kind of did a lot of the kind of front end work in trying to build out this data set. It often involved trying to manually match places across decades over time. And so effectively what we did was built a longitudinal data set of rural places using the census, the American Community Survey, and captured a whole bunch of different economic and demographic characteristics for these rural places. The second issue that we had to contend with was this county problem, which I just talked about. So this is actually a map of the RUC codes, the county classifications here. And so what you can see here, particularly in blue, these are places that would typically be thought of as rural according to those county RUC codes. And when you look at this map on a first take, it immediately makes a lot of sense. So the middle of the country, of course, looks much more rural than the coasts. But where we started to immediately realize that we were going to have problems is when you look to regions of the country like the Southwest. So these kind of red and orange colors and somewhat into the green are regions of the country that would be classified as urban according to the RUC codes. And so what you can basically see is that the vast majority of particularly the southern areas of California and a lot of Arizona are uniformly classified as urban, even though we know that, you know, it's certainly the opposite to that when you drive, you know, half an hour outside Los Angeles or, you know, 20 minutes outside of Phoenix. These are definitely not rural places. So this is the kind of problem that we were immediately trying to tackle. So let me just give you a quick example of this on the ground. So this is actually drawn from the HISTAC data set that Stefan and Johannes have published online on their Harvard Dataverse. And this surface is capturing Maricopa County Maricopa County, which is the county which embeds Phoenix in 2010. And so you can see the outline of the city here. And if you overlay Maricopa County, what you can see is that, yeah, okay, so the county does well in capturing most of the city, particularly in the northeastern area of the county. But immediately as you start to go into the Southwest, you can see that there's not a lot out here, right? So under a county RUC code, this entire county would be classified as a metropolitan, you know, urban county, and any small settlements out here would immediately fall under that urban category. So what we do in this project, and this is led primarily by Johannes Ull, who's a geography PhD from CU Boulder, was to derive this index of rurality, which is focused on classifying these census places along an urban to rural continuum, which is much more continuous than the RUC codes, and which can be applied at really kind of fine granularity. So it uses a mixture of the total population of the place. It uses a focal population density window to try and capture kind of the local population density around the place in question. And then also the distance of that place to other places of different size categories. So we're kind of incorporating both the size of the place, but also its kind of spatial proximity to other urban places or rural places as a means of classifying urbanness or rurality. And if Stefan, if you want to share Johannes's manuscript link in the chat, feel free to do that. But it's a super interesting index which can be applied to a whole bunch of different contexts. But here, what we're going to do is use it to effectively make the cut in our sample and classify our places as rural or urban or otherwise. So we've got about 8,000 places. It's actually 8,400 places in our analysis, which we classify as rural based on this index of rurality. So we have a longitudinal data set of places. What we do is actually take 1980, which is kind of our starting point, and we make a cut on the data set in 1980 of which places we think of as rural in that base period. And we do that using this kind of place level rurality index. And we have a threshold, which is about 0.55, which we came to through a mixture of both kind of, you know, qualitative manual inspection of the index, but then also some kind of more rigorous kind of quantitative comparisons to try and back out something here. So just to kind of put this index in perspective a little bit, remember this is that county around Phoenix, Maricopa County. And so when you apply the index of rurality to Maricopa County, what you can see is that these areas, particularly in this kind of northeastern part of the county, are immediately classified as urban under the index. But what you can see is that these blue parts of the county come out as much more rural. So this is effectively what the index lets us do. It lets us look within counties and distinguish between urban and rural places, and even examine how those changes are unfolding within counties over time. Just a quick snapshot. So that was our map of county rural to urban continuum codes. And then this is our index of rurality. And what you can see, particularly in the Southwest, is that you get much more granularity in distinguishing urban and rural, urban from rural places. It's much smoother. And it gave us a great deal more flexibility in trying to classify places along this continuum. Okay, so the third and final piece of this, so we built the data set, we've classified places as rural or urban or not. The third was to start thinking about, how these places are changing over time. And so our main goal when we set out was to think about these places in a kind of a broad perspective, right? We weren't just interested in population, we weren't just interested in economics. We kind of wanted to consider these things in kind of in a much more multi-dimensional sense. And so we spent a bit of time searching for different types of methods that kind of might do the trick for us. And eventually what we landed on was this kind of emerging body of approaches, which is referred to as sequence analysis. And what we're going to focus on here is actually multi-channel sequence analysis, which is kind of like a newer stage of these statistical procedures. And I'll just talk through kind of descriptively what we do here and what it lets us do. So in the first step, we've got our places. Each place is observed in 1980, 1990, 2000, 2010, and 2018. And what we effectively do is take that data set, those place year observations, and we stack them all on top of each other in one data set. So we have our 8,500 places, let's say, times 5, that's the length of the data set. We stack them all on top of each other. And then we look for each place year observation. We look at two sets of attributes. We look at the demographic attributes related to, and those are going to be related to total population and age structure. And then we look at the economic attributes, which are going to be focused on median household income per capita and the poverty rate of places. So we can have two sets of attributes. And how this approach works is you effectively run a kind of a k-means clustering, or you can use a different clustering method if you want, to effectively put each place in each year in an economic box according to those economic characteristics, and in a demographic box according to those demographic characteristics. So if you take, let's say, Tempe, Arizona in 1980, it's going to have an economic cluster that it belongs to, and it's going to have a demographic cluster that it belongs to. And that same place in 1990, it might belong to the same two clusters, or it might change clusters over time. So you can see just a quick visualization here. I have these kind of different blocks. There's 4 economic clusters across the period, ranging from kind of high income, low poverty down to kind of lower poverty and high income. And there's 6 demographic clusters, which are different mixtures of place size and kind of older and younger age structures. And so what the multi-channel sequence approach lets you do is it allows you to pull out the kind of dominant forms of changes and how places are moving across these 2 dimensions over time. So effectively what we do is, and this looks like a total mess, so I don't want, I'm not going to focus on the interpretation here, but I just wanted to give you the visualization of what's going on. You have these different trajectories of changes across these clusters over time, and the multi-channel sequence approach lets you pull out the dominant forms of change along those 2 dimensions. So effectively, in the end, every place gets sorted into one trajectory across all time periods and the 2 clusters. Okay, so for each place, whether it's Boulder or Tempe or somewhere more rural, in this case, the urban places are not in the analysis, it's rural only, but every place gets one trajectory in the end, and that's what we're focused on. Okay, so let me just briefly talk through the results. I'll give a high-level overview quickly, and then I'll focus on a couple of the sequences and just to kind of illustrate what we're seeing here. So we end up backing out 6 dominant sequences of change across the period. So I've kind of given them kind of shorthand names here to give you a sense of what these look like. I'll just draw attention to the first 3 to begin with. There's a large sequence or trajectory of kind of high persistent poverty and places that are relatively young. That's one set of places. There's about 1,500 places that fall into that trajectory. There's another kind of stable trajectory, which is kind of persistently high income for rural places, but their age structures are also are aging over time. And then there's a couple of more dynamic trajectories. One is a set of places that had this really sharp post-2000 rise in poverty. And number 4 is a set of places that also had a really sharp rise in poverty after 2000, but also kind of had this decline in more recent years. So there's a mixture here of both changes of trajectories which are associated with stability, but there's also these trajectories which are much more dynamic and really like radically changing over time. And I'll dig into those in just a second. Just a quick snapshot. So this is just a graph of the poverty rate for rural and urban places, just the averages over time. You can see rural poverty is higher than urban poverty across the full period. And what I want to show you here is these gray lines, which I overlay in the back. And these are the 6 trajectories that come out of our sequence analysis. I'm not going to highlight which one is which here, but I really just want to illustrate that you can see down here, really interestingly, 3 of these trajectories actually have poverty rates which are quite close to the urban average. Okay, so you can see, you know, the red line here, that's the urban average. There's 3, 4, maybe even trajectories down here, which are kind of approaching the urban average. But then you have these really high poverty rural trajectories up here, which are, you know, way and beyond the rural average and certainly out of the range of the urban average. And this is just to kind of illustrate the kind of broad range that you actually see in these trajectories, right? There's a lot of variation. And you see this across pretty much all 6 variables that we include in the analysis, a really kind of wide range in terms of these different trajectories and where they're going. So we're not picking up small changes or small differences in these trajectories. There's a really wide range here, and some of which suggests that some rural places look more like their urban counterparts even than other rural places, which I think is fascinating. The second snapshot, you don't need to, you know, you don't need to be trying to read these labels. I'm going to dig into a couple of them in detail in a second. But the other thing to highlight from these trajectories is that they have a really striking geography. So if you look at these 6 maps, which capture the 6 trajectories, you know, particularly, you know, if you do 1, 2, and 3, you can see these really kind of sharp, really strong patterns, which are showing the concentration of the trajectories. So yellow areas in these maps are places where these trajectories are particularly highly concentrated. So for example, in trajectory 1, you can see that these places are really heavily concentrated in the south, for example. So what's really striking about these maps is that no explicit spatial information goes into the statistical procedure. It's all demographics and economic attributes at the place scale. Yet even when you run this trajectory analysis on those kind of, you know, cross-sectional place level attributes, you get these really striking spatial patterns. So that suggests that a lot of these changes have this kind of really strong geography.
Dylan, can I ask a clarifying question?
Sure.
When you mean local concentration of trajectory, do you mean basically like the score for that trajectory at the place level, or are you aggregating them into some other spatial unit?
So what we actually do here is because places are very small, there's 20,000 of them, and it's a little bit tricky to visualize. What we did was we created kind of also like a focal window where it's almost like you take a place and then you look at the trajectory of that place and the trajectories of the 100 nearest places, and calculate the percentage of places that, you know, fall into one of these 6 bins. So it's basically like, you know, what's the local concentration of any of these 6 trajectories? So in parts of the South, for example, you know, 6 or 7 out of 10 of the places in these areas, you know, will be in trajectory 1. That's how we calculated this. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So you see these really, really striking geographical patterns. So in terms of these trajectories, what I'm going to do here, and I've called them sequences here, but I'm using kind of sequence and trajectory interchangeably. I'm just going to focus on these top 3 and just talk through those in detail and show you what we're seeing here. So let me start with the second of these. So these are places that are going to be relatively high income, but have kind of older age structures. So this is actually the largest single trajectory. There's about 2,000 places falling into this. Average population size of these places is about 1,200 people. The poverty rate's about 11%, and about 18% of the population is over 65. In terms of the kind of other attributes of these places, which are not included in the sequencing, these places tend to be very white compared to other rural places. They tend to have relatively high college education, college attainment, and in terms of average income, look relatively prosperous. And they're really focused in kind of the upper Midwest and plains and the North Central Mountain region and coming across into Colorado. So these are kind of like, of the rural places, the relatively more prosperous rural places, let's say. So that's our kind of second, that was our trajectory 2 in that table I just showed you. What's fascinating is, do you remember at the beginning, I talked through that place, Orange City, Iowa, which was that place where the small town American Dream lives on. Well, Orange City falls bang smack in the middle of this little cluster here in this trajectory, right? So, it's actually nice when you kind of do this kind of ground truthing and you see it actually come out and make sense in your trajectory. So that's what we're seeing here. Orange City, poverty rate, just to flag this quickly, runs from roughly 6% in 1980 and stays, it's only at 7% in 2018. So it's a very persistent, low poverty, relatively high income place relative to other places. Sequence 1 is really a sequence of kind of high persistent poverty and relatively young age structures. And what really, I think, 2 things really jump out here. The first is that of all the trajectories, these are by far the most Black in terms of their Black population shares. They're heavily concentrated in the South, and they show really persistent patterns of high poverty rates over time. So this is really a trajectory of persistent racialized poverty across the 80 to 2018 period, heavily concentrated in the South, and in many ways is kind of the opposite to the sequence that we just looked at. Just as a quick example, this is Uniontown in Perry County in Alabama, which is one of the lowest income, highest poverty counties in the US. Uniontown has got a lot of press over the last few years because of a whole bunch of environmental disasters, poisoned water, and so on and so forth. And Uniontown falls right into this trajectory here. Just to put those poverty rates then as well in context here. So when we looked at Orange City, the poverty rate across this period was roughly in the 6 to 7% range across the period. What you can see with Uniontown, you're seeing a poverty rate which is 10 times higher, 46% to 48% across the period, right? So it's an amazing polarization here in terms of difference. And the third and last sequence that I want to spend a little bit of time on is this sequence tree, which is this post-2000 rise in poverty. And there's the pattern here is a bit more mixed in terms of its geography, right? The yellow is the concentration here. These places are very white, but also in contrast to that first sequence, which I talked about that was spreading into Colorado, these places also tend to be much more, have a much stronger history of industrial activity. So if you look at the 1980s statistics, a lot of these places were dependent on manufacturing or extraction. They're really concentrated in northern Michigan, Appalachia, eastern Washington. And there was actually a recent paper focused on political polarization in rural America. And they have a map which shows places which flipped from, or regions of the country that flipped from Obama to Trump in the 2016 election. And the map actually looks very similar to what we're seeing here. So we don't directly examine political issues here, but it is interesting to see that these trajectories do seem to have some resonance for other issues. And that place, Rogers City, which was the place that had issues with, the woman wrote in about drug use and alcohol. Rogers City falls right into this trajectory here. Interesting fact about Rogers City is that I believe it has the largest limestone quarry in the world. So it's one of these places that was kind of a big industrial extraction center at one stage. And things seem to have changed quite rapidly since the mid to late 20th century. Just looking at poverty rates here, Rogers City has a poverty rate of 12% in 1980. And you see this kind of sharp increase in poverty kind of up to 2018, things grow up to 22%. So this trajectory really is built around these kind of sharp increases in poverty in these parts of the country. So I'm not going to go into the remaining three sequences. They kind of all have their own stories, and I don't think it's necessarily useful to spend too much time, going through each one. But those three, I think, are particularly resonant and insightful. So the last thing that I wanted to touch on before I start to wrap up is kind of returning to this question of, well, are these trajectories mainly a kind of a historical descriptive device that can let us kind of track historical change in local populations over time? Or do they have kind of a bit more of a social science resonance that can actually tell us something about social processes in places today, and that are, relevant to our thinking about contemporary issues? So what we did, in addition to constructing these trajectories and trying to measure these changes over time, was to then try to link these changes to the intergenerational mobility outcomes of people growing up in these places over the same period. So Raj Chetty and his team have introduced or have published a bunch of great tract level, census tract level, intergenerational mobility estimates for children born in the 1978 to 1982 birth cohorts. So basically what it is it's looking at kids who are born to parents in the bottom quarter of the income distribution and where they ended up in the income distribution as adults. And so what we were interested in was effectively the association between adult intergenerational mobility outcomes and growing up in a place that's effectively following one of these trajectories over time. So the existing literature on intergenerational mobility points to things like region, racial composition, the share of single-parent households in a place, dependency on manufacturing. So what we wanted to do was to actually control for all of those things. Okay, so control for all of the things that we know are associated with intergenerational mobility already, and then look to see if after we do that, there's an effect associated with a place following one of these trajectories over time. Effectively, so it's kind of like a scale thing going on here. Is the trajectory of your place, does that translate into some kind of effect on the people growing up in that place at the same time? So the outcome here is the adult income rank of children born to parents below the 25th percentile. And really what we're focused on here is the effect of the trajectory. So really what the thing to focus on here, just the blue and the orange circles here. This is the estimate on intergenerational mobility relative to that trajectory associated with high and persistent poverty over time. So that's the reference category. So that was those places that are concentrated in the South. And then we're looking at these other trajectories relative to that one. And so two things really jump out, I think. First of all of the blue lines are to the right of the zero, which suggests that the high persistent poverty places have the lowest levels of intergenerational mobility. And the places that are significantly different from those places are these more prosperous sequences. So that place where that trajectory that Orange City was in, the more prosperous aging places, okay, there's a wide margin of error, but what you see are relatively higher intergenerational mobility outcomes here. So these are differences in the adult income rank of the kids. The kids in those places who are growing up in those places fare better as adults in income terms. And likewise with these kind of more stable declining poverty trajectories, which I didn't get into in too much detail. But what you can see is a clear difference here. Interestingly, the places that are experiencing the high rises in poverty after 2000, there's no significant difference between intergenerational mobility for kids growing up in those places relative to those places in the South. So you really see kind of a double division here of places that actually, look quite different from those high persistent poverty places, and then places that look quite similar. And this is controlling for everything you can think of that we could pull from the census to try and nail down what could be going on here. So we're really trying to capture the effect of the trajectory. Okay, so just to wrap up quickly. So what we're seeing here are, okay, so across rural America, we do see these broad trends. Places are aging in general. But what we're showing here is that there are many different phases, and really strikingly different phases of rural change. So we're seeing really persistent poverty in some places. We're seeing persistent, let's say, relatively high incomes in other places, and even some optimistic changes in others. The trajectories that we've pulled out have a really strong geographic footprint. They're highly racialized, and they're linked to economic structure. And the point we really want to make here is that we're not just looking at trying to describe geographical change here, but what our trajectories are really capturing are shifting local contexts that do translate into important social outcomes like intergenerational mobility, which is at an all-time low in the US at the moment. So we're picking up kind of real local social changes here. So I'm just going to wrap up there. I just want to thank everybody for joining. I really appreciate it. Look forward to questions. Just one quick thing I wanted to say. I'm happy to get into this if anybody's interested. But the current state of the manuscript is that it's written up. We sent it out. It unfortunately got rejected at our first stop, and we're in the process of revising the manuscript now. So this is a great time to share the work and talk about it, and I'm happy to talk about the submission process or whatever else afterwards. So thanks for your attention.